Good morning, monsters, and welcome to Monsters on the Edge. Good morning, Resnick, and good morning, Lee. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you guys here. We are set for an amazing show here. We are going to be doing a little high strangeness and changing things up. Instead of Bigfoot, we are going to be talking Mothman today with my guest, Steve Ward. But before we get to that, we got some normal housekeeping as usual. Guys, I want to show you a little bit about what we got going on over at Cryptids, Anomalies, and the Paranormal Society. I invite you to check out our YouTube page. Check this out. Are you interested in the paranormal, ghosts, spirits, and the metaphysical? How about Mothman, Bigfoot, and other cryptids? What about UFOs, UAPs, and other anomalous phenomenon? Then you need to check out Cryptids, Anomalies, and the Paranormal Society. We have all that and more. Watch our series, Caps Road Trip, where we travel across the U.S. in search of these phenomena and bring you not only the history of these locations, events, and encounters, but evidence that we capture along the way. Alongside our team of researchers and investigators, you never know who will be joining in on the investigations. Are you interested in Bigfoot in Upper Michigan? Check out Finding Heighten, a series documenting the Sasquatch activity on a very special 80-acre property just outside of Menominee that has been a hotspot since 2012. Want even more? Check out our podcasts. Whispers from the Dark is the official podcast of Cryptids, Anomalies, and the Paranormal Society and brings you interviews with the top names in the field of paranormal to cryptids and more. Hear witnesses' accounts and go in depth with the CAPS team to hear more about our ongoing research. Are you more into cryptids? Find links to our all cryptid show, Monsters on the Edge, on the Untold Radio Network. If you're into spooky, subscribe now and you won't miss a minute of our brand new series coming soon, Spirits of Mackville. Follow along as we uncover the haunted history dating back to 1877 of a very well-known location you may have never guessed would be haunted. Head on over to YouTube and hit that subscribe button and you won't miss a minute. Awesome, guys. Check it out. We got all kinds of stuff, something for everyone on Wisconsin Caps. And guys, if you want to see us in person, you can also find us on Paraflix. We have a whole series on Bigfoot in Wisconsin. On the Trail of Undiscovered Beasts is streaming now, season 1 on Paraflix Paranormal Plus. You can use promo code CAPS10 to get 10% off your first 3 months. If you want to show your support for Cryptids, Anomalies, and the Paranormal Society, head on over to our website, wisconsincaps.com. Click on Shop Our Store or go directly to tpublic.com/user/Wisconsin-Caps. You can show your support with our logo on whatever kind of merchandise you got to get. You can also head on over to all of our social media platforms. We are Wisconsin Caps at Patreon, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, and WI Caps on Instagram. Coming up, guys, you can see us in person at the Glen Beulah, Wisconsin Great Lakes Paranormal Conference. There's going to be a lot of great people there. This is coming up September 22nd through the 24th in Glen Beulah, Wisconsin. Get all the information, GreatLakesParanormalConference.com. I'm going to be giving a presentation on cryptozoology at the Kenosha Public Library on October 6th. And I'll be at the Milwaukee Paranormal Conference October 14th. Check that out at MilwaukeeParacon.com. And then, guys, we're going to wrap up our season here at CryptidCon November 18th and 19th in Lexington, Kentucky. All right, guys, if you want to show your support for the Untold Radio Network, here's how.
Hey, Untold Radio Network fans. Want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
All right, guys, it is time for the moment that you've all been waiting for. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest is a researcher of all things high strangeness and the world of Mr. John Keel, as well as all things Mothman. So without any further ado, please welcome to the show our guest today, Steve Ward. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Well, thanks for having me here.
Oh, thanks for being here, man. You got an amazing event coming up here. I'm not sure what is the anniversary of it. Do you know?
It started in 2002. It was the first Mothman Festival,
Awesome.
and they have it every third weekend in September. So this year it falls on the 16th and 17th, Saturday and Sunday. And on both days they have all kinds of speakers. They'll be down in the VFW hall, and it's just an amazing event. It's free. But the first thing I want to tell people is the one thing that does cost a few bucks is the TNT hayride. Now, the TNT area was a munitions area during World War II, and you can look at the old photographs, the huge complex that was there. It's been nicknamed the TNT area forever, even though they closed shop. Most of the building disappeared. When the Mothman was first seen in the 60s, there wasn't much left. And today it's the McClintock Wildlife Area. Well, on Saturday night, we take people in the dark into the dreaded TNT area. We have three basically hay rides. Two of them are proper hay rides. One of them has nice, comfortable seats, which I call the old man cart. And usually that's the one that I helm. And I hope I get that same one again. It's hard sitting on those, steadying yourself on those bales of hay. But that's the only thing that costs a few bucks. And what you do is you get there early Saturday morning, and you go to the information booth and get your ticket. It's like about $5, and inflation hasn't caught up with that for years. And it is an absolute blast, but it does sell out. And we go late into the night, so they can't do it forever. Can't do it until dawn. So make sure you get that ticket. But beside that, you've got all the usual suspects. You've got all kinds of vendors, T-shirts, food, on the right at the Mothman Museum. Now, it's going to be a little hard to get into the Mothman Museum during the festival. If you can get there early Friday, you can probably get in easy enough, which is really well done, really well put together by Jeff Walmsley. But the street right next to it, perpendicular to the main street, is where the Mothman statue stands, and along that side street is where the speakers usually have their tables, besides many other vendors. So the speakers are all different. They're all interesting, and they're very accessible. So it is really 2 days of fun. You can talk to all kinds of people that. About these kinds of subjects, unlike some of your friends and family members that look at you cross-eyed or sideways when you tell them, where you're going for the weekend.
Absolutely. Who are your speakers this year?
Oh boy, I don't have the whole list, but some of them are. We got two of the original Mothman witnesses, and these two ladies were not mentioned in the book. One is she's known as Faye DeWitt, but her name is actually Faye Laporte, I believe, and she's the one you've seen her on many documentaries, where she her sort of catchphrase is, "It had the biggest, reddest eyes you ever did see." And she and her siblings went out there just right after the Mothman sighting started. Her brother thought it was a joke, so he was going to give his brothers and sisters a little bit of a scare. Drove out there, and sure enough, they saw this thing. So you'll hear a story there. Linda Sigmund was she was on my show, The High Strangeness Factor, recently. She was 16 when all this went down. She was about 12 miles north of Point Pleasant. She and her boyfriend saw a strange light like an orb floating around, and he did not see it, but she saw basically the Mothman. This was in April, before the bridge collapsed in December of 67. She also had a man in black encounter. She had no idea of the context of that until years later when she read John Keel's book. So she will be there, and she has a really interesting story. Chitan Noir, who I know from Michigan, is I'm trying to remember what she's talking about, certain kinds of cryptids and some that are not as well known. And two really good guys that have been that I met at the Van Meter Visitor Festival years ago, Chad Lewis and Kevin Nelson. Chad Lewis and Kevin Nelson, and I believe Noah Voss wrote the book on the Wendigo. Well, Chad is going to be talking about the Wendigo. And Kevin Nelson is going to be talking about some of these, I guess maybe you could call them virtual cryptids, like the Slender Man, some of these that seem to come out of virtual reality, like a tulpa or whatever. So he will be there too. And Bill and Jackie Kuselis, they wrote Bridging the Tragedy. And they went and interviewed people that, as we know, at the end of the Mothman events, December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed and 46 people lost their lives. They went and they interviewed people, family members, survivors, and people in the community, and how they dealt with the trauma. And fascinating book. Jeff Wamsley is one of the people that is interviewed in it. And I know I'm forgetting a few other people, but if you you can just check it out online. There's a whole, and I will be speaking there on Sunday. If I have survived that by that time, and I don't have people carrying me in on a stretcher, I will be talking about. I'll be giving kind of I guess a little bit of a Mothman refresher, but I'm going to be talking a great deal about John Keel as well. I've always said you can't talk about the Mothman phenomena, the year of the Garuda, so to speak, without talking about John Keel. And I have some information on Keel that most people don't know about. And I'm going to be looking at the Mothman entity or elemental, whatever it was or isn't, uh, in comparing it to certain things. I'm also going to be dealing a little bit with when we hear the Mothman prophecies, I'll be dealing with the prophecies aspect. John Keel was in contact with many individuals that firmly believed they were in contact with some kind of other intelligence, space brothers or whatever. And they were getting prophecies and messages. And there was kind of a trickster element to much of that. So I'll be covering, hopefully, John Keel and the Mothman in a slightly different way than is usually covered.
Awesome. Sounds great, man. And that is this coming weekend, right?
Yes, it is.
Awesome. And that is in Point Pleasant, West Virginia.
West by God, Virginia. Yes.
Awesome. Yes, I have actually been there. We did an episode of our show for Caps. We came out 2 years ago when the Mothman Festival wasn't going, but there was still a ton of people. That was the last year of the COVID shutdown there still. And I mean, there was like 3 or 4 vendors out there, and there was still a massive amount of people there, and it was a good time and a lot of cool stuff.
We always went down those 2 years. The diehards we weren't going to let some little plague stop us. So we went down anyway to meet, see old friends and to have a good time.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I can only imagine what a full-fledged festival will pull in, and I've heard amazing things about it. So it's going to be a good weekend.
Last year was crazy, so I don't know what to expect. I'm glad I just live up the street now. I moved down from Michigan about a year ago, so I literally live on the same road that the Scarberries and the Mallets were chased by the Mothman back on November 15th, 1966. I'm just a few streets from where the Silver Bridge once stood. So I can just walk downtown, which is a good thing.
You don't have to look for parking then. Awesome. Well, let's get into this because you've kind of mentioned a little bit about the story and everything. Why don't we go back to the first incident and just kind of give a brief history of what happened? Why are you having the festival? What is Mothman for people who may not be familiar, or some details that most people may not know?
Well, when I was uh, in Michigan in junior high, March 1966, we had a wave of UFO sightings, landings, and so forth. And that was one where they sent Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He was still attached to Project Blue Book. So he was still kind of tied to their apron strings, even though he had come to believe that there was something really to this. When they sent him down there, they wanted him to kind of diffuse the situation. So he had he's the one that uttered the phrase swamp gas. He said that some of the sightings might have been caused by swamp gas, which was probably not going to happen in March in a swamp, just for the wrong weather condition and so forth. So that was pretty amazing. But a few months later, well, actually more than a few months, that following November was the first major sighting of the Mothman. And it hit the wire services all over the world. It hit the Stars and Stripes newspaper, military newspaper, and my regular hometown newspaper. I lived in the Detroit area, and it talked about these two couples being chased in a car by a winged humanoid down Route 62 into the Point Pleasant area. And what had happened there, and this is even before Mothman had a proper name. The locals just called him the bird. So I what happened was it was uh, uh, Linda Linda Scarberry and her husband. They and Steve and Mary Mallet. That was Roger Scarberry, by the way. They were driving around the old TNT area. Now, back then, you could just drive around there. You can't. There are barriers there where you can't just drive around. There are places you can go back and see some of these what they call igloos or concrete bunkers where they used to store the munitions for World War II. And these things were all covered with foliage, so that if the enemy ever flew over, it would look like just kind of a hills and so forth. And now it's really covered over. It's a very very creepy area in the daytime. You can imagine how creepy it is at night during the TNT hayride. Well, they were out there just driving around, and they were driving literally by the old North Power Plant, which was torn down in the 90s. And Linda said, "What's that man doing standing in the road?" And then that man spread his wings, a 10-foot wingspan. And then they noticed it shuffle off toward the Old North Power Plant. I think they thought it went inside, but it had red, piercing red, glowing eyes. And they decided to leave. So they took off. They went down Potters Creek Road, made a left south on Route 62. And as they started, they saw it again, or its kissing cousin, standing next to a billboard. So then it flew after them, and they hit speeds of close to 90 miles an hour on this treacherous winding road, and they lost it once they got back into Point Pleasant. They went to the police department. They separated them all, and they all told essentially the same story. This thing was about 6, 7 foot tall, humanoid, 10-foot wingspan, and again, the red glowing eyes. And they couldn't really see much of a head. It's almost like the head was kind of maybe sunken into its chest, perhaps. But there was actually a sighting in Clendenin in a cemetery a couple days before. Grave diggers were out there, and they saw this winged creature. It wasn't quite as dramatic, but dramatic enough. If you're digging a grave and you see this thing, are you going to think it's some kind of an omen and take up Scrabble instead? I don't know, but it was pretty scary. But that's the one that hit the wire services. They had a press conference. You can see the old photographs where they're all being interviewed. Uh, when John Keel found out about this, he was actually in Washington D.C. at the time, pestering the Air Force, trying to get information out of them. And his old buddy Gray Barker. Now Gray Barker was the guy that ran Saucerian Publications out of Clarksburg, West Virginia. He went down in 52 to interview the witnesses of the Flatwoods Monster. So he had been doing this for a while. He had these great publications. I think everybody believes that Gray embellished things a little bit, maybe punched things up. Literary license, I think, maybe was his middle name, but he convinced John Keel that there was something to this. So Keel joked in the Mothman Prophecies that he loaded up his 14-foot monster traps and took off to West Virginia. Now he was a journalist in New York, had been there for a long time, and he at first thought it was people were just seeing some kind of large bird, and he was looking for signs that an animal, a large animal, might leave behind. But after he interviewed over that year, about November, roughly, actually, he came down in December of '66 through December of '67. He interviewed personally a little over 100 people, and the basic descriptions were very similar. Some people actually saw something more like a large bird. Even some National Guardsmen were kind of insistent that we didn't see the Mothman per se. We saw a large bird. So that was the thing that triggered it, and then and then it went crazy. I mean, I guess people were lined up to get into the TNT area in long lines with cars, and some of these guys had their shotguns with them, bow and arrows. They were going to bag themselves a Mothman. So actually, John Keel, and he became a friend and colleague of Mary Hyre, another important figure in all this. She was the a stringer for the Athens Messenger. She wrote a column for the Point Pleasant newspaper called "Where the Waters Mingle," and she was the one covering Mothman sightings, UFO sightings, and even Men in Black encounters. And they would go down with other people sometimes a little south of there to a place called Galloplus Ferry. And if you can imagine what it was like down there in the hollers half a century ago, pretty desolate, they would find a hill, abandoned hill somewhere, and just sit there. And all kinds of lights, strange UFOs were coming overhead. The Mothman incident wasn't the only thing that was going on at the time. It was sort of a three-ring circus of the paranormal. So that's where they went to get away from the maddening crowds. Um, also, there were when you get into the Men in Black reports, um, John Keel used Men in Black as kind of a generic term. That didn't necessarily mean gentlemen dressed up in black suits with black fedoras. Now, he did notice that there were a lot of people in town that were probably just government officials. I mean, they had the skinny black ties, the close cropped haircut, and didn't say much and had no sense of humor. Obviously, FBI, right? So, but some people were, Mary Hyre had some really strange characters come into her office. Some guy identified himself as Jack Brown. He had kind of a stutter. He seemed to be fascinated by a ballpoint pen. He asked a lot about John Keel, and he said to Mary Hyre, "What if somebody told you to stop publishing UFO stories?" And she said, "I'd tell them to go to hell." And so, we don't know if this guy was just, as you know, there are people attracted to this realm. Some of them are a little off, maybe, to put it politely. Maybe this guy was just a little off, but there are a lot of these. When you get into the lore, there's a lot of reports about Men in Black, strangers to show up, maybe want to confiscate photographs, maybe want to tell people not to tell their story, or just indulge in some really odd behavior. So there's not one aspect of this. It's all over, and that was something that was going on at the time. Keel also noticed that there were animal mutilations going on in some of the farms and so forth. So this is one of these high strangeness areas where all these different types of phenomena were taking place.
Wow. Like I know John Keel mentions like a window area, right?
Right. He first talked about that in a book called Strange Creatures from Time and Space. that- that's my favorite edition because it has this great Frank Frazetta painting on the cover where you see the patrolman with the wide brimmed hat with his hand up and he's being plagued by a whole array of cryptids coming at him. But it has been republished in trade paper size as the Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings. That was 1970. And that's where he started to get into the idea of window areas. He noticed that when people were reporting UFOs and so forth, and even reporting some of the entities that seemed to come out of them, um, uh, close encounters of the third kind. And by the way, this is in the good old days before the Greys took over. We had some pretty cool humanoids back in those days, but he he noticed that while they had the general shapes that were the same, cigar shaped, disc shaped, egg shaped, and so forth, there were very, very few that were identical. And he wondered, what does this mean? What, how could there be so many different varieties? Even the entities, although, well, some of them are similar, they are all very different too. So does it mean there are hundreds and hundreds of alien civilizations, you know, um, visiting us, or is something else going on? He actually, it's very. I always say it's very difficult to condense some of Keel's ideas into a few paragraphs, but he became a little disenchanted with the ET theory after a while, and he thought that some of these things were. Uh, uh, well, he noticed that if you go through the history of this, uh, there were strange lights in the sky, and they would be identified as the fairies. Or perhaps there was even a time when they thought that they were literally witches flying on their brooms, and the light was a lantern. There's other traditions in other countries that, while they're not witches on brooms, there's some kind of an entity carrying a lantern or whatever. But then, as time went on, you had the great airship mystery in the late 1800s. And always this technology, if that's what it was, almost steampunk, really. It was always a little bit ahead of us. I mean, it was ahead of any dirigibles or zeppelins that we had at the time. And then, you had the ghost planes in Sweden, way up in the north. Didn't make any sense. Where were they coming from? They had, by 8 propellers, and where was their base? Where were they coming from? Then you had the Foo Fighters of World War II. These strange lights. Some of them weren't very big that would follow the planes, and the Allies thought it was the Germans and Japanese. The Germans and Japanese thought it was us, and the Russians thought it was everybody else. So you have this sort of, and then you have the more modern day. You have the sort of metallic disc-shaped objects with the dome, but now and more recently, you're getting more in the way of lights and blobs. It's almost like there's this progression. And so Keel thought that these things, and again, this is going heavy into Keel. He thought these things were possibly transmogrifications, one of my favorite words, of energy. That these things, it was some, he used the term ultra terrestrial. It was a term he borrowed from Ivan Sanderson, the great British naturalist, probably best known for The Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, wrote great books on UFOs and the unexplained. Ultra terrestrial simply implied I guess, another realm, another dimension, but this intelligence or force alongside of us, interacting with us, and actually literally co-creating some of these phantasms. That's why he thought, he thought that some of these would manifest. They were paraphysical; they weren't hallucinations. Leave footprints, and then at some point in the Eighth Tower, which is a follow-up to the Mothman prophecies, he talks about how the poor slobs literally melt after a while. After the energy dissipates, and that's why these things seem to show up out of nowhere, leave some physical evidence, hair samples, footprints, and scare the living daylights out of people, and then go away. He gets more into depth in this, into Operation Trojan Horse. This is where he brings everything together. Poltergeist phenomena, cryptids, and so forth. Another thing he discovered. Uh, One of the early, when he arrived in Point Pleasant in December, uh, Mabel McDaniel gathered together, called a lot of the original witnesses, and they all came over to her house. That's when he first met Mary Hyre, and he first met the Scarberries and the Mallets, and he heard all their stories. Well, he also met Connie Carpenter. She was one of the a young lady about 19 or 20, I think. She was leaving church and she was driving by the Mason County Golf Course. She saw classic Mothman standing there, and he takes off straight like a helicopter, doesn't flap his wings. She notices the piercing red glowing eyes, and it flies over her car. The next day, she has a case of conjunctivitis, eye burn. Now, this is often associated with close proximity of UFOs, some kind of a metallic craft or strange light. Keel said he noticed that people that experienced both cryptids and uh, um, strange lights or UFOs suffered from the same physical ailments, sometimes conjunctivitis, muscle ache, thirst, and so forth. So he thought perhaps some of these things actually had a common origin. He got to the point where he just wasn't that interested in the manifestation. He didn't want to know how many windows the UFO had. He didn't even want to know exactly what the Bigfoot looked like. He wanted to understand the cosmic mechanism behind these things, and that's what he tried to deal with in things like Trojan Horse and the Eighth Tower. One other thing I should mention: a lot of people have an idea of what Mothman was, and some people are still on the sandhill crane or a big owl. And I just wanna go like this when I hear that. But to each his own. Here's the thing: you have to listen to the experiencer. Obviously, we try to qualify anybody we're talking to, but while the general description of Mothman held with most people, not everybody, but most, the behavior was bizarre. Again, it didn't always flap its wings. Something 6, 7 foot tall, and it would take off straight like a helicopter. The eyes didn't seem to be reflective. It seemed like it was generating its own light. There were some people that talked to Keel that had a close proximity sighting with this thing. They said it sounded like something humming or mechanical. Mrs. Thomas, who lived in the TNT area, actually, there were people that lived out in that area. This is toward the end of that year. She saw it not flying, but walking on the ground incredibly fast, she said, like a robot. And Faye DeWitt, by the way, one of the original witnesses, she it was running by her car. She didn't actually see it fly. She thought when she saw it jump up on the Old North power plant, she actually didn't see it fly per se. It was sort of like a huge leap. Um, One of the common things that happened, John Keel found this in a Swedish researcher named Franzen that followed John Keel a couple years later and interviewed many of the same witnesses and many other witnesses that are not mentioned in the Mothman prophecies. Virtually everybody had an outbreak of poltergeist phenomena when they got home after they saw this, and strange phone calls, beeping outside the house and inside the house, just just bizarre stuff. How do we reconcile all this? There was the Greys; they were missionaries, and Pat Gray wrote a book called, I think it was called The Thing. She spoke at the Mothman Festival several years ago. She and her husband, when this all started, and they didn't know anything about it, they were due to go off to another country as missionaries the next day. That night before, Mothman manifested in their home. Exactly the same description: 6, 7 foot tall, red glowing eyes, wings. They viewed it in a demonic context, which would make sense. Years later, when they came home and started looking through the newspapers and the books, they thought, my God, that's what we saw manifest in our room. I talked to another young lady once that had that happen. So, what are we dealing with? A purely physical being doesn't make sense. An apparition doesn't necessarily make sense either. John Keel thinks he saw some footprints that it may have left by the Old North power plant. And the poltergeist activity, uh, you know, Keel talks about a chimera, which comes from the old Greek. It's a kind of a hodgepodge monster put together. but it had flaming red eyes, and it left the smell of fire and brimstone, sulfur behind, as in many of these cases do. So, uh, I actually, somebody the other day on a show asked me, well, what was the Mothman? And usually I just dodge the question because I don't really know. And I go through all the litany of all the different things, and I wonder, well, I actually said Mothman is an elemental. Now I couldn't tell him what an elemental was, but uh, the thing is, John Keel in his writings would use the word elemental and ultra terrestrial interchangeably. Interchangeably. By the way, he also said he used ultra terrestrial as kind of a literary device. He wasn't trying to be dogmatic. I think Keel pretty much believed that there was more than one answer to some of these things, as I do. But he admitted he was never able to solve the mystery of the Mothman, which at least lets me off the hook because I haven't either.
Awesome. Yeah. I don't know either, man. That's very interesting. We are going to take a really quick break here for station identification. And guys, after the break, we are going to be taking some questions from the comments section. So anything John Keel related, anything weird and high strangeness window areas, questions about the festival, we'll get to that right after this.
Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
We are back here on the Untold Radio Network with my guest, Steve Ward. He is a researcher and a high strangeness aficionado of all things John Keel and the Mothman, and great event coming up this weekend, the Mothman Festival out in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Get your questions in the comments and we'll get to them. I got a comment here. It says, I don't think that anyone has seen a sandhill crane chasing cars for miles at night with glowing red eyes.
I tend to agree. Keel had a little fun with he called them type A scientists and type B scientists. This is in Strange Creatures from Time and Space. And one was sort of a regular scientist, and one was attached to a university that had to publish or perish. And he named one man, I forget what it was. Remember the coelacanth, the fish that ugly fish that they thought had been extinct for 65 million years, and then they found it off the south, I think the coast of South America. There was one when they first had those reports. This one particular scientist that Keel quotes said that look, we all know that. This has been extinct for 65 million years, and besides, it's a deep water fish. It's impossible. 10 years later, when it was established, that same scientist said, well, we've all expected this, and that to happen. And Keel says, by the way, it is a shallow water fish. So this guy was just kind of rolling with the times and completely wrong. I mean, how often have people been wrong? Now, that being said, I don't think I tend to think that whatever Mothman is or was was not some kind of a flesh and blood creature. I'll say that.
Very cool. Here is a question for you about the convention itself, the festival. Val says, about 6-hour drive, staying in one of the newer hotels outside of Point Pleasant, first time attending. Any tips on parking? We will be there Friday around 1 p.m. Thank you for your visiting tips.
There's some lots there along Main Street where you can pay to park. Sometimes you can go way, way, way north on Main Street and find a place. But it's not easy. Now there is a place called Cordell Park, but there's a little bit of walking to get from there into Point Pleasant. So it can be a bit of a challenge if you get out there early Saturday morning. you got a better chance of finding some place to park. So, and it's good that you'll be there Friday because you can move around a bit. It's going to be very crowded. So, we're going to have. I guess maybe I should be careful about advertising this, but there's a place called Village Pizza up the street, north of Point Pleasant by a few miles, right near 30th Street. That used to be Tiny's restaurant, by the way. There was a classic Mothman sighting overhead in '67, I think it was. But a few of us are going to get together informally on Friday night for dinner at Village Pizza. So come on down. Now, I hope I'm not getting 2 billion people there, so I can't even sit down, but I'm going to take a chance there. But we'd love to meet you. And yeah, just get out there early Saturday morning. You've got a decent chance, I think, of finding a good place to park.
Awesome. If you guys have any other questions or comments, put them in the comments section on whatever platform you are currently watching on, and put them in all caps. That'll get my attention over there, and we can get to those. Talking a little bit about John Keel. I've read a couple of his books, and it always fascinates me how, these were written in an age before modern media and all this other stuff, and it's just fascinating that there's so much information in there that I'm trying to get to a point here. I really am. He talks about these topics as if they are 100% real. And I don't mean to say that, they're not. But when you read the older books and stuff, they talk about like the Yeti as a flesh and blood creature and how it exists. And nowadays, a lot of the times when you read stuff about these, if you're not reading researchers or investigators of the topic, they're written off as folklore. So it's always fascinating to read these older tales and these encounters and stuff because it's written from a totally different perspective.
Well, he saw his first UFO when he was 7 years old. He was born in 1930. He was driving in his parents' car, saw this glowing orb, ball of light in the sky. When he was in Egypt in '57, he saw his second UFO, a classic disc-shaped object with a dome. He knew they were real. He didn't know what they were, but he had no patience for people that tried to explain them off. He started out thinking these things were probably ET, but there were so many contradictions that where it just didn't fit. I mentioned earlier about how he talked about these transmogrifications of energy. These perhaps these things manifest the same source, the same energy, but these things manifest in different ways. Well, it's interesting if you go back and look at Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who we know as the author of Sherlock Holmes, who was a paranormal investigator in his day, wrote a book called The Coming of the Fairies. And in talking about the fairies, the elementals, he said their appearance is due partly to the person viewing them, sounding just like John Keel 100 years ago. Very interesting. He had, he talked to so many of the people that had these bizarre experiences that he was had no doubt that there was a reality to this, but he just thought that too many of the he called them saucer buffs were on the wrong track, trying to look at this as strictly nuts and bolts or flesh and blood. Now, he did think that some of these cryptids were likely real animals. If you read Strange Creatures from Time and Space, he talked about type A cryptids and type B cryptids. Type A were the real ones. He thought perhaps the Yeti at the time was a flesh and blood creature, and maybe some of the water monsters. But some of the other ones just didn't fit a flesh and blood creature.
So I have two questions here for you. I would be remiss if I did not bring up the topic of in one of Keel's books, and I can't remember which one, he talks about these creature attacks over in Europe. I can't remember where, like in what am I trying to say? Like London and that area over there. And they are very much reminiscent, like almost to a T, of the chupacabra attacks in Puerto Rico. There's these rash of chickens being killed with just puncture wounds, and goats. And do you know anything about that more?
Well, he talked about these entities that seem to come out of nowhere. When they manifest, he thought they behave like real creatures. They eat food, they attack chickens and all that stuff, and then their energy dissipates and they're gone. There's a I try to remember the year in Illinois, Rochelle. There's the Rochelle monster, and of course, the Missouri, the Momo monster,
Hmm?
the Bigfoot. They had to, I guess, they had to copy that, so they called the Rochelle monster Roro, which I've always said sounds like Scooby Doo trying to form words. But this was there's a young lady named Zelia Edgar that has a great chapter on this in her book, Just Another Tinfoil Hat Presents. She's a Keelian, by the way, and with a really keen mind. And I envy the way that she analyzes some of these cases. And she also coined this great term called lost in transmogrification, because some of these cryptids come out, the Enfield horror came out with 3 legs, pink glowing eyes, and arms jutting out of his chest. Boy, I'd hate to see the mold on that one. But the Roro monster, it's like it started to slowly manifest into reality. People were hearing pounding on the side of their house. They would feel a breath on the back of their neck, but nothing's there. Then they would see this thing, but sometimes it was translucent. And then it started leaving footprints. It's almost like it was, slowly coming into transmogrification. And then it attacked a bunch of livestock, chickens, and that sort of thing. And then it dissipated and was gone. So, uh, it's so hard to put some of these, when you get some of these reports, it's very difficult to try and put these in the context of simply some elusive, unknown animal that remains hidden somehow.
Mhm. And like I said, with a lot of these books and talking about the different reports and stuff like that, you can see, like you were talking about with Roro and Momo, you get the same descriptions of these creatures over and over again. But because you don't have the modern, the internet, social media and stuff, you're getting these different creatures all over the world with very similar um, descriptions and MOs and the attacks or the sounds and stuff like that. But you're not getting that complete picture because you don't have, you have the wire service, the newspapers and stuff reporting. But aside from that, you have these very localized stories and legends in that, like there have been reports of the Mothman all over the world as well. And not just, in recent times in that, but throughout history, there's been these creatures like the Ahul is a very similar creature in Papua New Guinea to what people are calling the Mothman, and so on and so forth. But go ahead.
Sometimes these winged creatures, a lot of people, it's very convenient to dub them all Mothman
Mhm.
when some of them are, we had the Wisconsin man bat at least a decade ago, and the father and son saw this thing brush against their windshield, this very ugly bat-like thing, and then they were nauseous afterwards. They had some kind of a ailment. You had the Houston Batman in the 50s, which was almost like a guy dressed up in a Batman suit flying around. I don't know how to explain that one. Um, Sometime now, I caution people that these may not all be Mothman per se, but on the other hand, if John Keel's right, and many of these things are emanating from the same source, perhaps they're just manifesting a little bit differently. Perhaps it is the same energy, the same intelligence. It's just very, again, it's very hard to determine. I get very protective of my Mothman
Mhm.
in Point Pleasant sometimes, so that's my own prejudice. But and then you have some of the so-called Chicago Mothman sightings. Some of them are a little dubious. I have 3 sources from MUFON that told me that some of the early sightings were coming from the same IP address.
Mhm.
This is not to diminish all of them, but I'll tell you one that was almost exactly like the Mothman of Point Pleasant, happened almost 3 years to the day that the Scarberries and the Mallets were chased by the Mothman. And this took place in Kent, England. The Saltwood Horror it was called, and these kids were leaving a dance at night, and they saw a light. Uh, um, a light behind a grove of trees. And then I think the light manifested again and went out. And then they saw this creature and it looked like Mothman. I mean, it shuffled like Mothman. It had the wings like Mothman. They said it was headless because Mothman did look kind of headless, except it had those piercing red eyes. This did not have the piercing red eyes. It had everything else. And it kind of shuffled off and they took off. Um, it's not clear. It's almost suggested by some that the light sort of manifested into this creature. And there were many reports like that. A researcher named Paul Devereaux wrote a book called Earth Light's Revelation, where he coins this term called proto entities. And he talks about a lot of cases where the light or the craft or whatever it is seems to be inseparable from the entity that separates from it. It's almost like it's all part of the same thing. So that's a whole nother interesting line of research, the proto entity idea.
Interesting. It's fascinating, and the thing about these is, I do tend to be drawn more to the older reports prior to the internet and stuff like that, because, like I said, you were talking about the incident in overseas and that people are describing what they see. And when these reports come out in books or in newspaper articles and stuff, it's not like, oh, I saw that too. This is what I saw. These are people describing a completely unrelated incident that they're giving the same description as another one. And that's what I was getting at as well with the older books and the older texts and stuff that discuss it that way, because it's so fascinating to see these things that, people who have no recollection of something that's happening on the other side of the United States, on the other side of the world, and they're having these same encounters, these same incidences.
Well, it's interesting when you look at the so-called close encounters of the third kind, where you see some kind of a craft or light, and in conjunction with an entity of some sort. Well, back in the old days, before the Greys took over, you could find something that looked like a Grey once in a while, but it's a whole different ball game then. And at the time, you had the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, and you had the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Well, that one was headed by come on, Major Donald E. Kehoe, and they would write about UFOs in the sky all the time, but they're very hesitant to talk about the guy who's driving it. They didn't. I guess maybe they didn't want to destroy their credibility. Whereas APRO wrote books like Flying Saucer Occupants, and those were fascinating to me as a kid. And they would talk about all, the classic ones like the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins, the Flatwoods Monster, the Cisco Grove aliens, and so forth. Um, so Keel wrote an article in True Magazine about this time when people weren't talking that much about landings and entities. And his name of his article was "Never mind the saucer. Did you see the guy who was driving?" And a little bit later, the editor of the publisher of True brought him into his office, and he pointed in the side of the office there in the corner. There were six huge mail bags of response to this article from people that were talking about their own encounters with whatever. So he really opened up the floodgates, and that was that was something that really needed to be done because so many of these things were taboo. Another thing, if you look at when the Greys kind of came in mass and sort of took over the scene, it happened around the time, two things. The late 70s and early 80s. Late 70s, the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out. And in the early 80s, Whitley Strieber's book Communion, with a striking cover with the face of the Grey on it. Now, maybe it's pure coincidence, but was there a shift in consciousness or focus, or were the Greys just the new kids on the block pushing all the other guys out because they're bullies? But it's interesting that that's kind of a shift, major shift, where it's not all Greys now, but mostly Greys, and back, like I say, back in the day when we had the awesome aliens, those are kind of been pushed by the wayside.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we are coming up on the end of the show today. If you guys have any last questions for Steve, get them in the comments now, and we'll get them in before the end of the show. But tell us again, remind us when and what you got going on this weekend in Point Pleasant, and then any other events that you're going to be at.
Well, it's the 16th and 17th, Saturday and Sunday, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the Mothman Festival. It's free, but if you want, get your ticket for the hayride. If you get there early enough, uh, speakers, food, T-shirts. You've got to buy 2 or 3 T-shirts. I mean, come on. So it's just going to be a lot of fun. There's a great lot of history there too, as well. If you're a history buff. In two weeks afterwards, at the very end of the month, is the Van Meter Visitor Festival. I will be, by the way, I'll be emceeing and speaking at the Mothman Festival. I will be emceeing at the Van Meter Visitor Festival, and Chad Lewis and Kevin Nelson, who will be speaking at Mothman, will be as they always are, at the Van Meter Visitor Festival. They're two of the guys who were instrumental in getting the Van Meter Visitor Festival going. It started out with humble beginnings, and it's growing. It's becoming a really a nice size festival, and so that will happen. And that's all I have. I might be speaking at a couple conferences in March, but those are kind of tentative right now. So. And also, I do the High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I've been on a brief hiatus because of all the stuff going on, but Andy Mercer and I have done 3 to 4 years of shows, and we're talking to all kinds of people. So it's just a lot of fun. Great talking to all these different, very interesting people in their own field.
Very cool. Very cool. If I can add one thing about the festival, we got to go out there, like I said, a couple of years ago, and everybody is familiar with the big Mothman statue right next to the Mothman Museum. But I talked to the lady whose father built the Mothman statue, and she pointed me down to the Riverwalk, where there is a series of other statues, all made by her father. And
Yep.
they're very cool to see. They're all very much in the style of that Mothman statue. And, coming into the city, I didn't know anything about it, and they're very cool. I highly recommend going down and check that out. There's some cool murals down there with some historical information as well. So
She's Kelly Roach. Her father was Bob Roach. You also find all kinds of murals on the flood wall of the various battles. If you go a little further down to Way Park, where the two rivers come together, you'll see where Chief Cornstalk was buried in the first battle of the Revolutionary War. If you go 2 blocks north of the Mothman Museum, you see where the Silver Bridge once stood, and there's a memorial, a mural, a memorial, and the 46 names of the people that died are on the sidewalk there. So it's all within easy walking distance.
yes, very much. Thank you so much for clearing that up for me. I am not a Mothman or Point Pleasant expert. I just know they're down there and they're really cool, and you should go check them out.
They are. I'm glad you pointed that out because it's something that people should see.
Definitely. Awesome, man. Steve, thank you so much for being on the show today. Thank you so much for all your wealth of knowledge. And I'll definitely have to have you back again for more John Keel wonderful stories and chat up that.
My pleasure. There's great stories about John Keel. He was quite a character and an amazing individual.
Very much. And definitely go check out some of his books because they're awesome. I have read a couple of them. I do a lot of stuff I can't remember off the top of my head, but a lot of his books. So very cool. Do you have a website or anything, or any place people can get a hold of you?
No, just get a hold of me on Facebook. Just type in Steve Ward. I think Point Pleasant. You'll probably find me. And the great Colin Wilson, the British researcher, said of John Keel, he was incapable of writing a dull sentence.
Very cool. Lauren says thank you to both of us for the show today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. All right, guys. Thank you again, Steve. I look forward to. I hope you have a great weekend here coming up, and the weather will be great. And hopefully, you guys have a good turnout again.
I just need the energy to what's the word I want? To persevere. That's what I want.
There you go. Awesome. Well, good luck to you. Have a great weekend, and have a good show in Van Meter as well.
Thank you, Barnaby. It was a pleasure being on the show.
Awesome. Thank you very much, man. I'll talk to you later. All right, guys. Steve Ward is from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The Mothman Museum, the Mothman Festival is coming to you this weekend from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Awesome time. Go check it out. A lot of great speakers there and a lot of great stuff to do and see in West Virginia, whether you're interested in the history of the area or Mothman itself. Go check that out. Coming up next week on the show, I have to check, is the one and only Lyle Blackburn is going to be joining us next week to talk about all things cryptid and Bigfoot and Dogman. So guys, if you're interested in Dogman or any of that stuff, sorry, check back next week, same time, same place, right here on Mondays at noon Central Time. Monsters on the Edge on the Untold Radio Network. And until then, guys, I'll see you on the edge.